A wealthy CEO experiences an instant connection with the awkward and late bridesmaid at his friend's wedding. Before we dive into the narrative, please share a comment about your location while you tune in. Delight in the tale. Emily hurried through the hotel hallways, gripping the hem of her dress as she navigated the risk of stumbling in her heels, which had once felt like the perfect choice. But at this moment, a final verdict. The strategy was straightforward. Get there ahead of time, assist with the setup, and dazzle as a bridesmaid. Yet, naturally, the cosmos chose today as the ideal moment to challenge her endurance. Initially, the taxi arrived later than expected. In that moment, a careless driver came dangerously close to hitting her at the hotel entrance. To make matters worse, the elevator meant to whisk her directly to the ballroom was crammed, compelling her to dash up the stairs. She would undoubtedly take home the title for the most accident-prone bridesmaid ever. "I apologize, I truly apologize," she murmured with each jolt, leaving the guests in a state of confusion. She stood merely a few paces distant. Emily could already sense the soft whispers of the guests within the ballroom, signaling that the ceremony was on the verge of beginning. And then it unfolded. Bam! Emily collided with an unyielding object. Or perhaps, an individual. The force was so intense that her bouquet soared through the air, her purse tumbled to the ground, and she came perilously close to meeting the hotel's lavish carpet face to face. Just as she was about to plunge into chaos, firm hands seized her by the waist, averting a complete disaster. The aroma of a luxurious cologne enveloped her, momentarily causing her to lose track of even her own identity. "Oh no, please tell me I didn't just hit an elderly man," she whispered, struggling to steady herself. "I can assure you, I am not an elderly man." The rich, resonant voice caused her to blink several times before she finally raised her gaze to meet the eyes of the man who had his hands on her waist. Emily almost gasped for breath. What sort of genetic injustice was this? The man before her appeared as if he had just emerged from the pages of a high-end fashion magazine. With dark hair impeccably styled and piercing blue eyes, there was an undeniable presence about them, a commanding aura that suggested a familiarity with authority. His expression blended curiosity with a hint of amusement. "You have arrived later than expected." Emily's eyes grew large with surprise. "Excellent," he had a keen eye as well. "Thanks for the insightful observation. Do you have any other fascinating insights to offer?" The corner of his lips lifted slightly, yet Emily had no time for flirtation or for dissecting just how absurdly charming that smirk was. She attempted to retreat swiftly, yet sensed a pull on her dress. As she glanced down, a wave of embarrassment washed over her, the fabric had snagged on her own heel. "Oh, wonderful, as if stumbling on my own wasn't sufficient, now I find myself ensnared as well." The man lowered himself gracefully, unfastening the fabric with a fluid gesture. "You may now proceed with your determined endeavor." "I was already en route." Just as she was about to flee, he remarked, "I trust you have life insurance, because at this rate, you won't survive the buffet." With a dramatic roll of her eyes, Emily snatched her belongings from the floor and stormed off, refusing to glance back. Yet amidst the turmoil, his voice resonated in her thoughts. "Avoid making eye contact with him. Refrain from casting your gaze in his direction." Emily recited to herself like a mantra as she settled into her role among the bridesmaids. The ceremony was already underway, and the bride, her closest friend, Clara, was casting her a fierce look. Yet Emily's attention was drawn solely to the formidable presence among the groomsmen. The individual involved in the crash. He stood before her, his eyes fixed on her with that familiar, scrutinizing look. "Who is that?" she murmured to a nearby bridesmaid. "Brian Fisher. What makes it important for me to know who he is?" "He holds immense wealth as one of the nation's richest individuals and leads a major global financial consulting firm." Emily blinked, attempting to absorb the details presented to her. "Absolutely. It's entirely logical that a billionaire would dedicate his time to rescuing awkward bridesmaids in hotel corridors. Her friend suppressed a soft chuckle. He is an enigma. Chillingly detached, meticulously strategic, never entangles himself with others, and it's rumored he possesses the power to dismantle anyone's career with a mere phone call. Emily took a deep breath. Excellent. She had not only come close to toppling him, but her demeanor had also been quite impolite. With her eyes gently shut, she inhaled deeply. Understood. The wedding was taking place. She merely had to endure the ceremony, steer clear of further calamities, and, above all, refrain from gazing at Brian Fisher. Yet, when she finally opened her eyes once more, she found him still gazing at her. He lifted an eyebrow, a knowing look in his eyes as if he could read her thoughts perfectly. A chill coursed through Emily, sending a tremor along her spine. A sense of anticipation filled the air, hinting that this night was only getting started. How about we engage in a fun little activity with those who merely skim through the comments? Drop a pizza emoji in the comments. Only those who have journeyed to this point will truly comprehend. Let us proceed with the narrative. Emily was never the type to feel easily daunted. Yet, in that instant, surrounded by the other bridesmaids and attempting to concentrate on the ceremony, she sensed the intensity of that stare upon her. Brian Fisher. She could sense his gaze lingering on her without needing to turn around. She sensed it. The atmosphere seemed to dissolve, leaving behind nothing but that captivating and mysterious essence. You've been toying with your hair for 5 minutes now. The bridesmaid beside her gently brought her back to the present moment. Emily froze, a rush of warmth flooding her cheeks. Have I? Absolutely. And you won't believe this. He continues to gaze in your direction. Emily briefly shut her eyes. Excellent. Exactly what I was looking for. What could possibly draw a billionaire CEO's gaze towards me? I'm merely an architect who nearly collided with him. Her friend merely shrugged. Who can say? Perhaps he enjoys a good challenge. Emily let out a soft sigh, attempting to center her thoughts on the ceremony unfolding before her. Yet, as the bride and groom shared their vows and the guests released heartfelt sighs, she remained unable to dispel the lingering sensation. The wedding reception was alive with energy. The ballroom shimmered with warm golden lights, as gentle melodies floated through the air. Guests glided gracefully between tables adorned with exquisite decorations, while waiters navigated the scene, balancing trays of sparkling champagne glasses. Emily focused intently on her responsibilities, assisting Clara, ensuring the bride was comfortable, and, above all, steering clear of any further awkward situations. Yet, as is often the case, the cosmos appeared to chart a different course. As she reached for a glass of wine from a waiter's tray, her movement was swift, leading her to once more bump into something solid. The shadowy fluid erupted. Time stood still. She paused, her breath caught in her throat, as the calamity played out before her in a drawn-out sequence. The crimson mark seeped into the immaculate weave of the ebony suit. Emily glanced upward in shock, locking eyes with Brian Fisher's piercing blue gaze. Please tell me this isn't real, she murmured, her fingers lingering on the empty glass. Brian looked at his shirt, then back at her, his face revealing nothing. Indeed, it did. Emily took a deep breath. I'll fetch a napkin. Hold on, I can take care of that. Before she could complete her thought, he coolly took off his jacket and rolled up his sleeves with a measured grace. Take it easy, it's merely wine. She blinked, taken aback. So, you're not planning to take legal action or kick me out of the gathering? A subtle lift appeared at the corner of his mouth. Not just yet, but if you're looking to redeem yourself, how about joining me at the bar? Emily blinked once more. Was that a beckoning call? It feels more like a trial. It hinges on your response. She surveyed her surroundings, searching for a way out, yet deep down, despite it all, there was an undeniable allure about him that captivated her. Perhaps it was the serenity, the assuredness in his tone. Perhaps it was the manner in which his eyes appeared to observe her with unspoken curiosity. Perhaps it was merely a sense of wonder. "All right, but I'll be the one selecting the beverages." Brian gestured towards the bar. "Astound me." The bar in the ballroom exuded luxury, yet it was enveloped in a serene silence at that moment. The counter was graced by only a handful of guests, lending the space an air of intimacy. Emily perched on one of the tall stools, arms crossed in a thoughtful pose. "I ought to indulge in something extravagantly priced just to witness your response." Brian inclined his head slightly. "You really believe I would be concerned about the cost of a beverage?" "That's precisely why it would be enjoyable," he laughed, and a slight tremor coursed through her spine. Brian Fisher chuckling. That was truly an extraordinary sight. The bartender made his way over, and Emily confidently placed her order. 2 glasses of whiskey. Brian lifted an eyebrow in curiosity. "Remarkable," she shrugged. "Did you really believe I would choose a fruit cocktail? It seems you enjoy catching people off guard." As the whiskey was placed before her, she lifted her glass, taking a moment to examine it closely. "So, Brian Fisher, do share your thoughts," she said as she turned to him. A subtle smile danced upon her lips. "What brings a high-powered CEO to a wedding that seems so out of sync with his typically reserved demeanor?" He swirled his drink thoughtfully before responding. "As the best man for the groom. Is your social life just a series of dull corporate gatherings?" Brian chuckled once more, and Emily experienced a peculiar sense of fulfillment. "Perhaps, but what are your thoughts?" "I hold the title of Bridesmaid of Honor, which signifies my presence is a matter of obligation rather than personal desire. And yet, it appears you are finding pleasure in this experience." She savored a sip of whiskey, relishing the comforting warmth as it flowed down her throat. "Well, the evening took quite a turn after I accidentally spilled wine on the guest of honor and nearly sent him tumbling in the hallway." Emily let out an exasperated sigh. "It seems like you'll hold on to that forever, won't you?" "Most likely not." They lapsed into a moment of quiet, yet it was a silence that held no discomfort. It was the sort that held an unvoiced tension, a presence that hovered between them, gradually intensifying. Emily averted her gaze, feigning interest in her beverage. "Is that how you typically observe others?" "What do you mean?" "As if you were attempting to unravel their mysteries," Brian smirked. "Only when I believe it merits the endeavor." Emily felt a sudden rush of emotion. What was unfolding in this moment? With a steadying inhale, she tossed back the remainder of her whiskey in a single, decisive gulp. "This was enjoyable, but I must return to the bride." Brian made no attempt to intervene, he simply observed her as she rose, his eyes remaining locked on her. "Catch you later, Emily." She paused briefly, then offered a faint smile. "Catch you later, Mr. Fisher." Yet, as she turned to leave, a sense lingered that this was not the end of their dialogue. The wedding buzzed with energy, yet Emily sensed a shift within her after that exchange with Brian Fisher. There was an elusive sensation, one that quickened her pulse in a way she couldn't fully articulate. She strolled back to the bridesmaids' table and grabbed a glass of champagne, attempting to overlook the reality that, mere feet away, Brian continued to observe her. Clara materialized next to her, a playful grin dancing on her lips. "I noticed the intriguing exchange between you and the enigmatic groomsman at the bar." Emily let out an exasperated sigh. "It was merely a light exchange of words. Nothing out of the ordinary." "Is there really nothing remarkable?" Clara arched an eyebrow. "That man was utterly captivated by you throughout the ceremony. Even from a distance, his gaze remains fixed." Emily chuckled nervously and took a sip of her beverage. "You're overstating things. He's simply fascinating." "Fascinating?" Clara let out a soft laugh. "Emily, that man is among the most influential billionaires in the nation, and according to what people say, he tends to keep to himself and avoids entanglements with others. If he has an interest in you, it's because he perceives something unique. Emily shrugged, yet the flush creeping up her cheeks was impossible to conceal. He simply enjoys observing and dissecting the nuances of human behavior, that's all. And to be truthful, I'm simply a regular architect. Someone like him would never take notice of someone like me. Clara let out a weary sigh and gently shook her head. Oh, Emily, you truly failed to grasp it, don't you? Before Emily had a chance to reply, a groomsman approached Clara, inviting her to dance and leaving her solitary once more. However, it won't last long. Are you really going to continue acting like you haven't seen us exchanging glances for hours? Emily briefly shut her eyes, then gradually pivoted to face the other direction. Brian was present. Way too close. I wasn't looking at you, Emily said quickly, attempting to sound nonchalant. Brian tilted his head ever so slightly, his intense gaze studying her in a way that sent her heart racing. It seems you struggle with deception, don't you? Emily folded her arms and released a mocking chuckle. Is this your usual demeanor, or do you take pleasure in unsettling others? A subtle lift appeared at the corner of his mouth. I enjoy watching and deciphering the ways in which individuals respond. Up to this point, you've proven to be quite an intriguing revelation. That's great to hear. At this moment, I must take my leave. She attempted to pull back, but Brian softly grasped her wrist, just enough to halt her movement. Join me in a dance. Emily's eyes grew wide with surprise. Excuse me. Just one dance. That concludes everything. She gazed at the dance floor, where pairs were already swaying to the gentle melodies. Then she pivoted to face him once more. And what if I decline? I would suggest that you are not being truthful once more. Emily bit her lower lip, struggling to suppress the smile that was on the verge of breaking free. You're incredibly full of yourself, are you aware of that? Brian paused for a moment, then reached out with his hand. And still, you find yourself here, contemplating my proposal. Emily inhaled deeply. What damage could it cause? Her hand found its way into his. As Brian guided her to the dance floor, Emily sensed that everything else had faded away. His arms encircled her waist with a subtle assurance, as his steady hand clasped hers. You've been here before, Emily remarked, attempting to overlook their proximity. Shall we dance? On several occasions. However, not in this manner. She raised her gaze, locking eyes with him in close proximity. What sets this apart from before? Brian observed her intently for a moment before responding. Me. A chill coursed over Emily's skin. The space was crowded, yet in that instant, it seemed as though only they mattered. And for the first time that night, she allowed herself to meet his gaze without hesitation. For she sensed that something was unfolding in this moment. A matter she found impossible to overlook. Perhaps, she had no desire to at all. Emily found herself in a state of uncertainty. Indeed, she was aware. She found herself dancing with Brian Fisher, a man who exuded an air of reserve, intimidation, and an undeniable persistence that was unlike anyone she had encountered before. Yet, she couldn't quite grasp why it seemed so instinctive. The ballroom buzzed with energy, yet all else faded into a haze as he guided her gracefully across the floor, each movement seamless and fluid. It was in that moment that she discovered the depth of her passion for dancing. Perhaps it was simply that Brian had an innate understanding of how to hold her hand, how to touch her waist, how to make each gesture feel effortless. Seamless. Are you taken aback? His rich voice echoed softly by her ear, sending a delightful tremor along her spine. Am I meant to be? You were surprised to find out I can dance. Emily fixed him with a piercing gaze. No, I did not. However, I suppose it is logical. I imagine you picked this up just like you have with all the other lessons life has thrown your way. Because maintaining a facade was essential. Brian wore a sly smile, an enigmatic sparkle dancing in his gaze. Is your straightforwardness a constant trait? It happens solely when my curiosity is piqued. So, Emily, go ahead and share. What other things pique your interest? Emily parted her lips to reply, yet his stare unsettled her composure. For a moment, she lost track of her thoughts. That seems unjust. What is not? Your captivating gaze pulls me in, making it nearly impossible to string together a clear thought. Brian emitted a soft, amused laugh. It's not my responsibility that you lose focus so quickly. With a heavy sigh, she resolved to take a step back. However, the moment she stepped back, Brian grasped her hand. Are you leaving so soon? Emily arched an eyebrow. I stand my ground. He observed her intently for a brief moment. Then demonstrated. Emily folded her arms across her chest. In what way? After a brief pause, he finally spoke, suggesting we meet for coffee tomorrow. Emily paused, uncertainty flickering in her mind. The prospect of encountering Brian once more the following day was alluring, yet fraught with danger. Fortunately for her, the music concluded precisely at that moment, and she gradually distanced herself as if nothing had transpired. Brian simply stood there, observing her with a grin. The gathering was coming to a close. As the guests began to bid their farewells and the bride and groom engaged with the final well-wishers, Emily sensed it was the perfect moment to take her leave. The day had stretched on endlessly, leaving her mind a jumble of disjointed reflections. She glided out of the ballroom, making her way toward the hotel entrance, where the guests' vehicles awaited. She took out her phone to request a ride, but a notification flashed on the screen, no drivers available at the moment. Excellent. She inhaled deeply, contemplating whether to hold off a bit more, when a recognizable voice reached her ears from behind. It seems your attempt to break free didn't quite go as intended. Emily gradually pivoted and discovered Brian Fisher beside her, his hands tucked into his suit pockets, wearing that keen gaze that made her uneasy. I'm not escaping, I'm simply heading back, though I don't have a way to get there. That's merely a minor point. Brian inclined his head ever so slightly, as though he were assessing the circumstances at hand. Then, without a moment's pause, he declared, I'll take you. Emily scowled. And you? Excuse me. I will take you home. The hour is late, and I feel it may not be wise for a woman to be waiting alone right now. She folded her arms across her chest. I am capable of handling my own affairs. I never claimed you couldn't, but what's the point of waiting when I'm about to depart? Emily nibbled on her lip. Taking a ride from Brian seemed off for countless reasons. Being in a car with him was an invitation to relentless teasing, with no way to escape his playful jabs. Secondly, there was an inexplicable quality about him that sent her heart racing in an unusual manner. She cast her eyes on the app once more, wishing for a driver to materialize, yet the display remained unchanged. All right, she finally conceded, but only because there was no alternative available to her. Brian remained silent. He effortlessly swung the car door open, patiently awaiting her entrance. Emily inhaled deeply and eased herself into the passenger seat. Once he entered and turned the key, a profound stillness enveloped the vehicle. In that moment, the silence weighed heavily upon us. The city lights danced through the windows as they cruised along. Emily nervously toyed with her fingers, caught in a dilemma between initiating a conversation or simply enduring the ride in silence. Brian, in contrast, appeared entirely at ease with the stillness. Is it your habit to drive solo? She finally inquired, merely to alleviate the unease. He cast a fleeting look her way before responding. There's something captivating about driving under the stars. Assists in my thought process. Oh, so you have the capacity for thought? She playfully arched an eyebrow. Brian offered a subtle smile, the kind that lingered briefly yet carried an unexpected weight. Are you really questioning that? You seem like an enigma. Does that trouble you? Emily paused momentarily before responding. I believe that to be the case. What is the reason behind this? Your presence exudes a certain intensity. As if you possess an unwavering command, as though nothing can ever rattle you. Brian fell silent for a moment, seemingly weighing her words carefully. Then, without diverting his gaze from the road, he stated with a steady tone, you have no idea the impact you have on others. Emily's eyes grew large as she glanced over at him. What is happening? He remained silent for a moment, maintaining that enigmatic half-smile, his fingers at ease on the wheel. He continued, speaking as though I were the sole enigma in this dialogue. However, Emily, I believe you may not fully grasp the extent to which you captivate those around you. She averted her gaze, a sudden and unfamiliar sensation swelling within her chest. It was merely a light-hearted remark. Perhaps it was not. The vehicle came to a halt at the crimson signal, and Brian shifted his gaze in her direction. Your discomfort around me stems from the belief that I scrutinize you excessively. Yet, the reality is that you captivate me, and I enjoy unraveling the mysteries that captivate my mind. Emily parted her lips to speak, yet silence enveloped her. She found herself caught in a dilemma, torn between feeling irritated by his audacity and feeling a sense of admiration for it. The remainder of the journey to Emily's apartment was serene, yet not uncomfortably so. The silence hung heavy with unvoiced reflections, each of them grappling with the weight of recent events. As Brian arrived at her building, Emily released a soft breath of relief. She felt a deep sense of gratitude upon returning home, but an unsettling awareness lingered within her, hinting that something profound had transpired between them that night. She faced him, a sense of urgency compelling her to speak before departing. I appreciate the lift. Brian inclined his head just a bit, his gaze examining her in a manner that sent her heart into a frenzy. It was a delight, Emily. She paused, uncertainty flickering in her mind. A certain quality in his voice sent a shiver racing down her spine. Desiring to escape the odd sensation, she swung the car door open and stepped out, ensuring to close it gently behind her. As she ascended the steps to the entrance, an unexpected impulse compelled her to glance back, and upon doing so, she caught sight of Brian lingering there, observing her. Emily averted her gaze and stepped inside with purpose. As the elevator doors sealed shut, she sank against the wall, releasing the breath she had been holding in. What just transpired? The following morning, Emily entered the construction firm's office, expertly balancing a cup of coffee in one hand while clutching several reports in the other. Following a weekend of attempting to push thoughts of Brian Fisher aside, she resolved to return to her usual rhythm, yet an unsettling feeling lingered within her. She had persuaded herself that their paths would never cross again. He was a billionaire CEO, navigating the elite world of high-profile investors and boardroom meetings, while she dedicated herself to her architectural projects. Their paths had no cause to intertwine once more. At least, that was her belief. Emily entered the conference room, clutching a folder filled with project documents in one hand while balancing her coffee in the other. Her colleagues had gathered, engaged in lively conversation, as Oliver Harris, the director of the firm, perused important pages regarding the Richmond Tower, the company's most ambitious endeavor. She found her place, preparing herself for yet another of those drawn-out, intricate meetings. Yet, the moment she raised her gaze to identify the figure at the head of the table, her heart sank. Brian Fisher. He stood there, clad in a pristine suit, his intense and discerning eyes meticulously examining the papers as though this were merely another transaction. Emily stood still. This simply cannot be occurring. As if attuned to her arrival, Brian raised his gaze gradually, and for an instant, time seemed to freeze. Her blue eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, the atmosphere in the room thickened, charged with an unspoken tension. To her utter surprise, Brian stayed calm and greeted her with a neutral, professional demeanor. Ms. Carter. Emily's eyes widened in surprise, and she almost let her coffee slip from her grasp. Is he acting as if this is perfectly fine? Perceiving the uncomfortable stillness, Oliver swiftly intervened. Emily, allow me to introduce Brian Fisher, the new lead investor for the Richmond Tower project. Her stomach churned. What is happening? Mr. Cut Fisher and his investment firm have taken a position in the project's financing. He will serve as our strategic ally as we progress. Emily glanced from Brian to Oliver, then to her colleagues, noticing that no one else appeared taken aback by this revelation. Only she remains. Brian remained silent. He observed with a serene demeanor as she grappled with the shocking revelation that had just unfolded. Emily inhaled deeply and managed to put on a polished smile. Greetings, Mr. Fisher. Glad to have you with us. Thank you, he replied, a faint smile gracing his lips, yet his eyes conveyed a different story altogether. Following the meeting, Emily was resolute in her desire to leave the place as quickly as she could. She craved a breath, a moment to digest the whirlwind of events that had just unfolded. However, it was clear that Brian Fisher would not allow it to go unaddressed. Just as she was about to leave the conference room, his voice called out to her from behind. Is that you, Emily? She briefly shut her eyes, then gradually pivoted to face the other direction. What is it exactly? Brian observed her intently, his arms crossed in contemplation. His impeccably fitted suit enhanced his naturally authoritative demeanor. With a scoff, she folded her arms, offering no warmer welcome. Are you in charge of me now? Not quite, but collaboration is essential. Emily sensed a parched feeling in her throat. Were you aware of this? Brian tilted his head just a touch, a glimmer of amusement dancing in his eyes. The instant I spotted your name on the project team, I knew something special was about to unfold. And you didn't consider that might be uncomfortable? I believed it would be intriguing. Emily expressed her wit and charm. She squinted her eyes. Or perhaps you had a hand in shaping it. Brian's smile spread gradually. You're overestimating my abilities, Emily. She felt torn between the urge to escape and the impulse to hurl her coffee at him. Yet, one thing she was certain of, there was no way to evade this any longer. The Horizon construction office lay in a hushed stillness, broken only by the swift tapping of keys and the rustle of turning pages. Emily focused intently on the document spread out before her, making a conscious effort to disregard Brian Fisher, who occupied a chair on the opposite side of the meeting room. Following the startling discovery that he was a key investor in the Richmond Tower project, she found herself compelled to confront the truth. Collaboration would be essential for the upcoming months. It appeared that Brian was relishing the moment a bit too much. Is that your usual expression when you're deep in thought? His voice broke through her reverie. Emily gritted her teeth before raising her gaze. Do you frequently pose unrelated questions when you ought to be focused on your tasks? Brian inclined his head, a subtle grin playing on his lips. It's only in the pursuit of understanding another that I find myself engaged. Emily folded her arms, a look of skepticism on her face. What is it that drives your desire to comprehend me? He rested his elbows on the table, observing her with an intense gaze that sent a flutter through her stomach. Your intrigue captivated me, Emily. She was at a loss for words. Her cheeks flushed, prompting her to swiftly redirect her gaze to the documents before her. Yet Brian's journey didn't end there. How about we head out for dinner? Emily blinked, taken aback. Excuse me. It's essential that we review the project details thoroughly. It will yield better results than working late at the office. This isn't exactly an invitation. It's merely a tactic to push me into working extra hours. If that simplifies acceptance, then certainly. Emily let out a weary sigh, acutely aware of her limited options. All right, but I'll choose the restaurant. Brian smiled, and inexplicably, it sent a flutter of excitement through her. The restaurant exuded a small, cozy charm, standing in stark contrast to the upscale venues Emily envisioned Brian frequenting. You truly transported me to such a straightforward place. He inquired, glancing about. I have uncomplicated preferences, Mr. Fisher. He let out a soft laugh as he reached for the menu. Do you really believe someone in my position wouldn't find this enjoyable? It seems that individuals in your position are only familiar with culinary offerings that feature names difficult to articulate and prices that rival a significant portion of my earnings. Brian lifted an eyebrow in amusement. While you may have a point, embracing new experiences can be quite rewarding. Emily chuckled, shaking her head in amusement. If you maintain that opinion after experiencing the flavors here, then I will take you at your word. As they placed their order, Emily observed that, for the first time since their collaboration began, Brian appeared noticeably more at ease. The familiar tension lingered, yet there was an intriguing shift in his tone, suggesting he was savoring the moment. He began, leaning his arms on the table. What is the appeal of architecture? Emily paused, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. Could you clarify what you mean? Has this been your aspiration all along? She gave a slight shrug. From a young age, I found joy in crafting and reshaping environments. Architecture offers me the opportunity to transform lives, Brian nodded, appearing truly engaged. And have you done so? Emily beamed, recalling one of her initial endeavors. Once, there was a client, an elderly woman, who sought to remodel her home to make it more accessible for her grandson, who had suffered an accident and was now paralyzed. Upon completing the project, tears streamed down her face. She claimed it would transform his existence. Brian paused for a moment before responding, "That's admirable." She chuckled gently. "Please refrain from complimenting me in that manner, Mr. Fisher. I've grown accustomed to your challenges at work. Perhaps I simply enjoy witnessing your irritation." Emily sensed a flush creeping across her cheeks. "You defy all odds, and yet, here you remain." The waiter arrived with their food, interrupting the moment abruptly. Emily swiftly picked up her utensils, attempting to dismiss the reality that Brian was indeed correct. She remained present, savoring the moment more than one might expect. After several hours, they finally departed from the restaurant as night had fallen. The glow of the city lights danced across the streets, while the refreshing night air provided a welcome contrast to the warmth indoors. "Feeling a bit drowsy, are we?" Brian inquired as they strolled toward the car. "Not exactly, but if you're set on bringing me back to the office, I'll play along." He chuckled softly. "Not in the slightest. The evening is quite pleasant. Shall we go for a stroll?" Emily arched an eyebrow. Brian Fisher meandering aimlessly without a defined direction. How intriguing. You mentioned that exploring new experiences is beneficial, right? She sighed dramatically, yet chose not to decline. They meandered leisurely through the tranquil streets, unhurried, simply observing the various little details around them. Emily could hardly believe how laid-back Brian was being. "Have you always been this way?" she inquired abruptly. "What do you mean?" "Quiet? Chilly?" Brian appeared deep in contemplation. "Experience has instilled in me a sense of caution, yet it doesn't diminish my capacity to feel deeply." That response took her by surprise. A hush enveloped them, yet it held no discomfort. It was imbued with an ineffable essence. Emily looked at him and understood that, for the first time, Brian Fisher appeared to be relatable. That posed a significant risk. Extremely perilous. Emily stirred awake that morning, her thoughts swirling in a fog. She was still reflecting on the events of the previous night. The dinner, the surprisingly effortless dialogue, and the realization that, defying all reason, she had genuinely relished her time with Brian Fisher. That was not satisfactory. That was not the expected outcome. She sprang to her feet, as though the act of staying occupied might banish her swirling thoughts. She had to put in the effort. She had to concentrate on the Richmond Tower project and, even more crucially, maintain her distance from Brian. However, the moment she stepped into the Horizon construction office, it became clear that this would not be a straightforward task. When Emily arrived, Brian was already present in the conference room. He occupied the head of the table, his demeanor serene and intent on the papers laid out before him, as though the events of the previous night had never transpired between them. With a moment of uncertainty, she paused, inhaled deeply, and moved ahead. "Good morning," she uttered, imposing a veneer of formality that didn't resonate within her. Brian glanced at her, a subtle smile playing on his lips. "Greetings, Emily. Did you have a restful night?" She gritted her teeth. He was fully aware of his actions. "Absolutely." Brian nodded, a hint of amusement dancing in his eyes at her reply. As the remaining members of the team trickled in, the meeting commenced. Emily compelled herself to concentrate on the intricate specifics of the project, the architectural modifications, and the financial plan. Yet, it was utterly unfeasible to overlook his presence. Occasionally, she sensed his eyes upon her, and with each instance, her pulse raced. Yet she kept it hidden. Following a gripping hour-long meeting, the team began to break apart. Emily collected her notes and rose to her feet, poised to depart before Brian had a chance to speak. But just as she was about to leave, he called out, "Emily." She paused for a moment, then steeled herself to appear utterly unconcerned before turning to confront him. "Indeed?" Brian shut his folder with a decisive motion and rose to his feet, smoothing out his jacket with a practiced gesture. "I would like to go over some project decisions with you." Emily inhaled deeply. This was a task. Simply focus on the task at hand. "Understood. Shall we proceed with it now?" "Certainly," he remarked, lifting his coffee cup and gesturing for her to accompany him. They strolled to the office balcony, a serene spot frequently utilized for casual discussions. The morning sun bathed the city in a warm glow, sharply contrasting with the palpable tension that lingered in the atmosphere. Emily rested against the railing, her arms crossed thoughtfully. "What specific topic would you like to discuss?" Brian observed her intently for a moment before responding. "Yesterday evening." She tensed immediately. "What happened last night?" "Absolutely." Emily squinted her eyes in concentration. "I believed our purpose was to discuss the project." Brian flashed her a small, irresistibly captivating smile. "We can discuss both topics." She exhaled sharply. "Listen, Brian, what took place last night was a dinner for work. That concludes everything." "Do you really think so?" Emily parted her lips to reply, yet the look on his face caused her to pause. Uncertainty hung in the air, and he was acutely aware of it, prompting her to bring the discussion to a close at that very moment. "I must be on my way," she declared, pivoting to depart. Brian observed her intently for a moment before uttering a remark that brought her to an abrupt halt. "You're intentionally distancing yourself." A chill coursed through her body. "This is not related to you in any way." "Indeed, it does." She glanced at him, irritation evident in her expression. "What makes you believe that the world centers on you?" Brian moved in, his aura enveloping the distance that separated them. "Because I understand this game, Emily." She paused, the air caught in her lungs. "What game are we talking about?" "The contest of separation. You're distancing yourself because there's something within you that you're reluctant to acknowledge." Emily felt a knot in her stomach. "You are entirely mistaken." Brian inclined his head ever so slightly, as though scrutinizing her every response. "Then gaze into my eyes and confess that you felt nothing last night." Emily took a deep breath. She felt the urge to reject it. She wished to express that all of it was devoid of significance. Yet, beneath the surface, she understood that would be untruthful. And therein lay the issue. Brian was fully aware of it as well. The stillness enveloping them was thick, laden with an unspoken tension that neither dared to acknowledge. At last, Emily paused to reflect. This is of no significance. I have tasks to complete. She turned and left, leaving him with unspoken words hanging in the air. Yet, as she departed, a heaviness settled in her heart. She understood that eventually, the time would come when she could no longer escape. Emily occupied herself for the remainder of the day, attempting to dismiss the dialogue with Brian on the balcony, persuading herself that he was mistaken, that she felt nothing at all. Or at least, that was the mantra she repeated to herself. Yet, as time went on, it grew increasingly difficult to overlook the reality. The strain between them had been escalating ever since Clara's wedding. Initially, she attempted to brush it off as mere teasing, a playful exchange of provocations that held no real significance. Yet at this moment, his presence now stirred a disquiet within her that she could no longer ignore. And Brian was aware of it. As the workday drew to a close, Emily collected her belongings and made her way to the office kitchen, seeking a brief respite before heading home. She took a glass of water and leaned against the counter, shutting her eyes for a brief moment. In that moment, she sensed the presence of someone standing beside her. She recognized the presence instantly, even before her eyes fluttered open. "It seems you're distancing yourself from me once more." Brian's voice carried a low, measured quality, yet an undercurrent of something more profound lingered beneath the surface. Emily inhaled deeply, gathering her thoughts before she turned to confront him. "I'm not trying to evade you. I'm simply aiming to focus without interruptions." He arched an eyebrow. "So now I'm just a diversion?" "You have consistently been that way." The words escaped her lips before she had a chance to hold them back. As the words left her lips, a flush crept across her cheeks. Yet Brian offered merely a faint smile, as though he had anticipated that response from the very beginning. At last, he spoke, his voice sinking to an even softer whisper. Emily folded her arms across her chest. "What comes next? You're finally acknowledging it." She exhaled in exasperation, turning her gaze elsewhere. "I refuse to acknowledge anything." "Indeed, you are." As he moved in closer, the atmosphere enveloping them seemed to radiate warmth. "Emily, you can continue to act as if this isn't unfolding, but we both understand that it is." She took a deep breath. "Are you curious about what's going on, Brian?" "This is not a priority for me right now." He appeared unfazed. He paused to observe her intently before responding. "There's always time for everything, except for confronting your true emotions." Emily briefly shut her eyes. This was a perilous endeavor. "This is not acceptable." "Why not indeed?" She lifted her eyelids and locked her gaze with his. "As a result of our collaboration." Brian's smile unfolded gradually, and in that instant, Emily realized he was not one to surrender without a fight. "What if we chose not to?" She paused, her breath caught in her throat. Brian leaned in just a bit, his proximity palpable, as if he were a tempest on the verge of unleashing its fury. "Share with me, Emily, if I weren't your backer, if you weren't so entangled in these regulations and limitations, what path would you choose?" Emily was at a loss for words. For she had always possessed that inner knowing. Brian did as well. The stillness enveloped them, thick with an unspoken truth. At last, Emily stepped back, shattering the moment. "I must take my leave." Brian allowed her to continue. He stood there, observing her retreating figure, and as Emily crossed the threshold, an undeniable shift settled in the air, signaling that nothing would ever return to its former state. The following day, Emily made an effort to adhere to her usual routine following the tense encounter with Brian in the kitchen of the Horizon construction office. Yet, the reality was that everything seemed out of place now. The atmosphere between them thickened, and she understood that eventually, a choice would need to be made. But what type of choice? She felt uncertain. Deep within, a whisper urged her to simply allow it to unfold. Yet logic always prevailed. Collaborating with Brian suggested that any interaction between them would inevitably result in complexities. Integrity, principles, standing, the stakes were incredibly high. Thus, she concluded that maintaining her distance was the wisest choice. But Brian Fisher was not the sort of man to accept defeat lightly. As the clock approached midnight, Emily finally found a moment to break free from her work. After examining the blueprints for the Richmond Tower project, she stepped into the shower and then sank onto the couch, utterly drained. Her mind was a whirlwind, and she craved an escape. At that moment, her phone buzzed to life. She extended her hand, anticipating an ordinary alert, but her heart raced when she glimpsed the name displayed on the screen. Brian Fisher. She paused, contemplating whether to open the message. "Brian, I would like to have a conversation with you. It holds significance." Emily shut her eyes and inhaled deeply. A portion of her wished to dismiss it, yet another part, the one that had been spiraling lately, craved to understand his intentions. "Is this related to the project?" "Negative." Her throat felt parched. "In that case, it can be postponed until tomorrow." She secured her phone, cutting off any chance of a response, and rested her head against the back of the couch, a wave of mental exhaustion washing over her. However, the reality? She understood that this was far from over. Indeed, she was correct. The following morning, upon her arrival at the office, Emily quickly observed that Brian appeared to be even more intense than he typically was. He refrained from speaking to her directly, yet his gaze conveyed all his unspoken thoughts, leaving her feeling uneasy. In the course of a project meeting, Brian consistently sought to provoke her at every opportunity, challenging her ideas, questioning her proposals, and fostering an atmosphere thick with tension. When it all came to an end, Emily felt a surge of frustration that compelled her to take action rather than ignore it. Once the other employees departed, she approached him. "May we have a conversation?" she inquired, maintaining a steady tone. Brian shut his folder and regarded her with a serene demeanor, yet one brimming with unspoken motives. "Absolutely." They entered a vacant meeting room. Emily shut the door with a soft click and folded her arms across her chest. "What was that all about?" "What was that?" Brian responded, seemingly oblivious to the subject at hand. The relentless teasing throughout the meeting. "Are you pushing the boundaries of my patience?" He inclined his head just a bit, as though observing her every action with keen interest. "And what if I am?" Emily let out an exasperated breath, clearly annoyed. "What is it that you seek, Brian?" As he moved nearer, Emily's heart began to race with anticipation. "I believe you understand my desires." She took a deep breath. "This is unacceptable." "What's stopping us?" "Due to its complexity." "Life is filled with complexities, Emily." Her patience was wearing thin. "Brian, we collaborate closely. That presents a significant challenge." He took his time before responding. He observed her intently for a brief moment before finally uttering words that transformed everything. "What if I shared that I'm stepping away from the project?" Emily's eyes grew large with surprise. "Excuse me?" Brian inhaled deeply. "I am in the process of transferring my stake in the Richmond Tower to a different investor." Emily sensed a knot forming in her stomach. "This is absolutely wild. What is the reason?" He offered her a subtle smile. "Now, there's no longer any reason for you to continue fleeing." She was utterly astonished by what she was hearing. One cannot simply abandon an investment due to this situation. "I have the freedom to choose my own path, Emily. All I desire is you." The stillness was overwhelming. Emily found herself at a loss for words. All the barriers she had constructed, every justification she had employed to distance herself from him, had vanished at last. And that terrified her more than anything else. She had to escape that place. I require a moment to reflect." Brian merely nodded, his gaze piercing. "Consider, Emily, but consider with caution." She exited the room in haste, her heart racing. Yet, beneath the surface, she understood that her ability to escape was dwindling. Emily exited the meeting room, a sense of instability washing over her as if the very ground was giving way beneath her feet. Brian Fisher had truly accomplished it. He sacrificed a multi-million-dollar investment for her sake. His words lingered in her mind, resonating with an undeniable intensity. I have the freedom to choose my own path, Emily. What I desire is you. She craved an escape, a moment to inhale deeply, to reflect. She sought an escape. Yet, regardless of her surroundings, his gaze remained the only thing in her sight. His gaze lingered on her, a knowing glint in his eyes, while she stubbornly held back the truth. Emily strolled to her office, oblivious to the bustling crowd surrounding her. She snatched her belongings in haste and departed silently, not uttering a single word to anyone. At this moment, she found herself unable to cope with the situation. Night had fallen by the time she understood she had been meandering without purpose for nearly an hour. Her legs ached with fatigue, her thoughts whirled in a chaotic dance, yet no resolution felt truly fulfilling. She entered a serene cafe, requested a robust coffee, and settled by the window, observing the bustling city beyond. Emily had always been the type to resist yielding to anything or anyone. She had consistently prioritized logic, placing her professional ambitions and autonomy above all else. Then, Brian Fisher entered the scene. He pushed her boundaries, stirred her emotions, compelled her to confront feelings she wished to avoid. And now, he had dismantled the final obstacle she had relied on to maintain her distance from him. What if I didn't hold the role of your investor? What actions would you take? With her eyes shut, she clutched her cup with intensity. Emily was certain of the answer. However, acknowledging it proved to be a different matter altogether. When she finally arrived home, the clock had already struck 11. The apartment lay shrouded in darkness, enveloped in an eerie silence. She flung her bag onto the couch and exhaled deeply. Her phone buzzed softly. She picked it up, and upon seeing the name on the screen, her heart raced with anticipation. Brian Fisher. Emily paused briefly. She had the option to overlook it, to act as if it had gone unnoticed. Yet, in that moment, she caught sight of something that caused her to halt in her tracks. It was not a message. A call had been made. He was making a call. She took a deep breath before responding. Emily. His voice resonated with a rich depth, unwavering and, now more than ever, laced with unspoken motives. What is it, Brian? She attempted to convey a sense of indifference. May we have a conversation? Emily shut her eyes, striving to maintain her composure. Our conversations at work have reached their limit. I'm not discussing work-related matters. The quiet lingered between them. Emily sensed a constriction in her chest. I'm not sure I can handle this at the moment. So, when should I expect to hear from you? She was left without a response. Brian let out a weary breath on the other end of the line. Until tomorrow, then. Brian. Sweet dreams, Emily. The conversation concluded before she had the chance to voice her objections. She gazed at her phone for a moment, her breath uneven. In that instant, she came to a profound understanding that was as frightening as it was unavoidable. She had no desire to run. She longed to see him. The following day began much like the previous one, or so Emily attempted to convince herself. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, her unease intensified. She was certain that Brian would come for her, and he always gave his all. As the clock chimed 6, Emily was busy collecting her belongings in preparation to depart. She had to return home, detach from it all, and find some clarity in her thoughts. However, the moment she exited the office, Brian was waiting for her. He stood by his car, clad in a perfectly tailored suit, his piercing gaze captivating all who passed by. Emily halted abruptly. Are you truly going to act as if you didn't notice me? He inquired, remaining still. She inhaled deeply, gathering her courage before moving ahead. "What is it that you seek, Brian?" He swung the car door open. "Come on in." "I am not, Emily." She shut her eyes, fully aware that resistance was futile. She felt a strong desire to leave. However, acknowledging that was a different story. In quietude, she slipped into the car. Their silence enveloped the car as they drove on. The air crackled with unspoken tension between them. Brian kept the destination a mystery. Yet Emily was aware he was making his way to his penthouse. For the first time, she chose not to argue. The vehicle came to a halt, and Brian was the first to exit, gracefully opening her door. Emily paused for a moment before ultimately stepping out. The ascent in the elevator was devoid of sound. As the doors swung open, Brian guided her into the expansive living room. Emily found herself unable to tear her gaze away from him. Every single aspect of this man filled her with discomfort. He removed his jacket, loosened the collar of his shirt, and poured 2 glasses of wine, offering one to her. She accepted it and took a sip, attempting to dismiss the unsettling proximity of him. "What brings me to this place?" At long last, she posed the question. Brian observed her intently for a moment before responding. Her heart raced, fueled by your reluctance to flee. "What if everything falls apart?" He advanced a step nearer. "And what if it succeeds?" Emily took a deep breath. Every fiber of her being urged her to go. To flee while the opportunity remained. Yet, she could no longer deceive herself. She desired him. In that instant, all else faded away. The apprehension. The uncertainties. Everything faded away as Brian gently held her face and pressed his lips against hers. In that moment, Emily understood that there was no way to retreat. Brian's kiss embodied all the trepidation and longing that Emily had experienced simultaneously. It was undeniably intense, without a doubt, as if he had been aware that this moment would inevitably arrive. And she, who had battled this for an eternity, found herself unable to resist any longer. She desired him. Brian drew her nearer, one hand placed softly on her waist while the other tenderly cradled her face. Emily sensed her thoughts evaporate, her hands clutching his shoulders as if seeking a lifeline. Time appeared to stand still. But then, the truth crashed over her like a tidal wave. What was she up to? Her breath came in quick, uneven gasps, her heart pounding fiercely within her chest. Emily recoiled abruptly, shoving Brian away just enough to sever their connection. I am unable to do that." Brian paused, his gaze fixed on her. He appeared unfazed. It appeared as though he had anticipated this response. "What is the reason?" he inquired softly. Emily brushed her hand across her face, feeling utterly conflicted. "This is not acceptable, Brian." He stepped back, yet his gaze remained fixed on hers. "Provide me with a genuine explanation." Emily struggled to arrange her thoughts, as the chaos within her felt overwhelming. "This is absolutely wild. And what defines normality?" he responded. She tightened her jaw, filled with frustration. "If I relent, then what follows? What unfolds next?" Brian folded his arms, his demeanor impeccably calm. "Together, we find the solution." She released a laugh devoid of humor. In an instant. Emily experienced a constriction in her chest. "I am unable to do that." Brian nodded slowly, but his next words sent a tremor through her very core. "I won't pressure you, Emily, but it's time to be honest with yourself." She paused, her breath caught in her throat. The quiet lingered between them. She turned and walked away, not glancing back, fully aware that everything had shifted irrevocably. The subsequent days proved to be a true trial of resilience. Emily steered clear of Brian at the office whenever possible. She provided brief responses in meetings, averted her gaze, and lingered a few minutes after to ensure she wouldn't encounter him. Yet, he certainly didn't simplify things. Brian refrained from initiating discussions, yet he made no effort to conceal his anticipation for her presence. Whenever their gazes intertwined, Emily experienced the same tumultuous struggle within herself. It was ripping her to shreds. Then, one fateful night, everything came crashing down. Emily found herself departing the office well into the evening. As she immersed herself in the intricate details of the project blueprints, time slipped away unnoticed. As she collected her belongings and made her way outside, the building had nearly emptied out. Just a handful of security lights illuminated the corridor. And then, just as she rounded the corner, he appeared. Brian leaned against his car by the parking lot exit, as if he had anticipated her arrival at that precise moment. Emily stood still. For a brief moment, she considered turning her back on him and simply walking away. Yet, she understood that she couldn't, for within her heart, there was a longing to see him. She longed to hear his voice. She had grown weary of this struggle. Emily paused, her eyes gently shutting as she contemplated her choice. She strolled in his direction. "Have you been anticipating my arrival?" Brian arched an eyebrow, yet his expression remained unfazed. "What are your thoughts?" She released a deep, weary breath. "Brian, please enter the vehicle." Emily folded her arms across her chest. "And what if I choose to decline?" He just smiled. "It's unlikely that you will." She tightened her jaw, exasperated by his unwavering confidence. Yet, beneath the surface, she understood he was correct. Emily entered the vehicle. Brian made his way to the driver's side, settled into the seat, and turned the key in the ignition. "Where are we headed?" she inquired. "You are already aware." And she certainly did. Brian's apartment remained exactly as she recalled. Flawless, structured, and naturally sophisticated. Yet, on this occasion, an unusual sensation lingered in the air. Perhaps it was the realization that she had stopped attempting to escape. Perhaps it was the realization that, for the first time, she truly desired to be present. Brian removed his jacket and faced her. "Emily." She raised her gaze to him, holding his stare this time. "Speak it aloud." He moved in, halting at a distance that allowed her to sense the heat radiating from him. "What is it that you desire?" His voice held a tranquil steadiness, yet it sent a shiver coursing through her. Emily hesitated before responding, for she was certain of her desires. From the outset, she had been aware, and now, all excuses had vanished. Brian smiled slowly, conveying his desire. "Then cease your flight." She remained silent. For the first time, she found no need to respond. As Brian grasped her hand and drew her nearer, Emily realized that there was no way to retreat. She had ventured into the realm where logic and longing intertwine. And she felt no remorse. The following morning, Emily stirred awake to the gentle glow of dawn seeping through the curtains. She needed a moment to grasp her surroundings. The expansive bedroom, the fresh linens, the subtle aroma of timber and cologne lingering in the atmosphere. In that moment, a memory surfaced. She pivoted gently, her gaze landing on Brian Fisher, who remained in a deep slumber beside her. He rested on his side, his breaths deep and even, a picture of tranquility, in stark contrast to her unease. Emily found it impossible to unwind. What had she accomplished the previous night? The response was clear, yet the deeper inquiry remained: what significance did it hold in the present moment? With deliberate grace, she eased herself out of bed, collecting her garments strewn across the floor. She moved with deliberate slowness, careful not to disturb his slumber. She required a brief pause for contemplation. Just as she reached for her blouse and began to slip it on, his voice echoed from behind her. "Are you escaping once more?" Emily stood still. She pivoted gradually and discovered Brian alert, observing her with that piercing look. He leaned back against the pillow, the sheets casually draped at his waist, his hair tousled just enough to be irresistibly appealing. She gulped nervously. "I'm not going to run." Brian arched an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. "So, why does it seem like you're attempting to slip away without rousing me?" Emily gritted her teeth. I required a moment for contemplation. He fell silent for a moment, observing her intently, as though attempting to decipher her innermost thoughts. He let out a deep sigh. Emily paused, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. Brian and Emily. He extended his hand. She understood that accepting it would leave no room for further justifications. Yet, before doubt could creep in, she moved ahead and rested her hand in his. Brian drew her back onto the bed, his gaze fixed intently on hers. "Do you wish you had done things differently?" Emily inhaled deeply. She ought to. Yet she chose not to. Absolutely not. Brian's lips formed a subtle smile. Just let go of the overthinking. She longed for the ability to do so. Yet, the reality was that her thoughts were in disarray. "What comes next?" she inquired gently. Brian glided his finger across her cheek, sketching an unseen route. "Now, we shall observe the path ahead of us." Emily maintained her focus on him. For the first time, she understood that Brian was equally entangled in this situation as she was. And that filled her with even greater fear. In the days that followed, Emily and Brian settled into a silent cadence, a routine that remained undefined yet was instinctively grasped by both. Let's enjoy ourselves a bit with those who solely focus on the comments. Leave a comment with Pepsi. Only those who have journeyed to this point will understand. Let us proceed with the unfolding narrative. At work, they maintained their usual professional demeanor. There were no gestures, no prolonged gazes, no indication that anything was different. However, it indeed had. The tension between them intensified with each passing day. Whenever they found themselves alone in the office, Emily sensed a palpable tension in the atmosphere. Each dialogue seemed heavy with hidden motives. Each look seemed to carry an unspoken understanding. And when night fell, they found themselves drawn to one another. It felt like an unseen force was drawing them back repeatedly, until one fateful day, that pull lost its power. Emily sat at her desk, meticulously going over the last tweaks to the Richmond Tower project when her phone buzzed. She lifted it and noticed a brief note. "Brian, please make your way to my office." Her brow furrowed in discontent. A surprise encounter? She tucked her papers neatly, snatched her tablet, and strolled down the hallway, making an effort to appear inconspicuous. However, the moment she entered his office and shut the door, it became clear that this was far from an ordinary meeting. Brian stood by the window, his hands tucked into the pockets of his suit, gazing out at the cityscape. He appeared to be on edge. Emily closed the door with a decisive click and folded her arms across her chest. "What is it exactly?" Brian pivoted with deliberate slowness. In that instant, she sensed that something was amiss. "It's time for a conversation." Emily paused, her breath caught in her throat. He had never initiated a conversation in that manner. "Concerning what topic?" Brian advanced a step nearer. "Who we are." Her stomach churned. "What about us?" He inhaled slowly, weighing his words with precision. "This situation is escalating beyond my initial expectations." Emily felt a constriction in her chest. "Is that an issue?" Brian hesitated before responding. And that was sufficient for her to grasp. A sharp flavor lingered on her tongue. "Are you looking to bring this to a close?" Brian raked his fingers through his hair, a clear sign of his mounting frustration. "I'm uncertain." She withdrew. "Are you unaware?" He gazed at her intently, his eyes brimming with turmoil. "Emily, you understand I'm not the type to get entangled in things." Her heart throbbed with a dull pain. "So, what prompted you to begin this journey?" Brian remained silent. In that instant, Emily came to a profound realization. She was wholly committed to this endeavor. What about him? He remained uncertain. Emily released a dry chuckle, shaking her head in disbelief. You claim to be the type who stays detached, yet here you find yourself, entangled. Brian tightened his jaw, a clear sign of his internal struggle to voice his dissent, yet he remained silent. Emily let out a soft sigh, attempting to push aside the increasing ache within her. If you're sharing this with me now, Brian, it's clear that you've already reached a conclusion. He remained silent. And that pain cut deeper than any words ever could. Emily was not the type of woman to plead. She remained true to herself, unwavering in her identity for anyone. Thus, she took the only course of action available to her. She stepped back and said, "All right." Brian's expression was one of astonishment. "Emily, there's no need for further words. I comprehend." She pivoted and exited swiftly, ensuring he wouldn't catch a glimpse of the tears welling in her eyes. Emily chose to stay away from home that night. She wandered through the city for hours, searching for a means to escape the emotions that enveloped her. Yet, it was utterly unfeasible. She had succumbed to the charms of Brian Fisher. Now, she had to forge ahead without him. Ultimately, he was never prepared for her. Emily chose not to attend work the following day. She lay awake through the night, her gaze fixed on the ceiling, searching for a way to ease the pain that throbbed in her chest. Yet, a straightforward answer eluded us. She had erred in allowing her heart to be captured by Brian Fisher. He was making a desperate attempt to escape before time slipped away from him. For her, the issue was that it had already become too late. The following morning, she reached out to HR, informing them that she required a day off. She switched off her phone and chose to ignore it for the remainder of the day. She required some distance. As the second day unfolded without Emily at work, Brian realized the error of his ways. He had endured a restless night, going over every word of their conversation in his mind. I tend to keep my distance from involvement. The gaze Emily cast upon him in that instant lingered in his mind, an unsettling presence that refused to fade. For the simple reason that it was not accurate. He played a significant role. Exceedingly so. More than he was willing to acknowledge. He had transformed into the very thing he dreaded above all else. For the very first time, he found himself at a loss, unsure of how to navigate the situation. As the afternoon waned, Emily caught the sound of the doorbell echoing through the house. Her brow furrowed in discontent. She had not anticipated the arrival of anyone. Yet, the moment she swung the door wide, her heart froze in place. Brian Fisher stood there, hands tucked into his coat pockets, his gaze sharp and resolute. With a firm grasp on the door, she prepared to close it without hesitation. "No," she replied with a flat tone. Brian stood his ground. "May we have a conversation? I have no words for you. However, there is something I wish to express to you." She gritted her teeth. "I've already heard enough," Brian sighed, running a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "I acknowledge my mistake." Emily experienced a constriction in her chest, yet she remained resolute. "Indeed, you were." He gazed at her. For the first time, he appeared to show a sense of vulnerability. "Emily, I struggle to navigate my feelings effectively. That has never been a part of my existence. I never required it." She let out an exasperated sigh. "Oh, that's wonderful to hear. Now, please enlighten me on how that relates to my situation. Your influence is undeniable, you transformed everything." She parted her lips to respond, yet silence enveloped her. I felt the urge to step back before things escalated further. Yet the reality is that it has indeed occurred. Emily paused, her breath caught in her throat. "Could you clarify what you mean by that?" Brian performed the final act she never saw coming. He moved closer, gently cradling her face in his hands, and softly confessed, "I'm in love with you." She became utterly still. "Excuse me?" He gazed at her with the utmost sincerity. "My heart is entirely yours, Emily, and I find myself utterly captivated by this feeling." Emily's heart raced, caught off guard by the unexpected words from Brian Fisher. Yet, in that moment, she came to a chilling realization. She wished for him to find his way. She was determined to seek him out. Emily inhaled deeply and grasped his hands. "Then cease your escape, Brian." He remained silent. He leaned in and pressed his lips against hers. And this time, neither of them held back. The kiss shared by Emily and Brian stood apart from all the rest. This time, there was a definitive clarity, a cessation of flight. It truly happened. In that moment, Brian embraced her with a fierce intensity, as if he feared she might vanish, while Emily's heart raced wildly within her chest. She could never have foreseen him uttering those words. "I have deep feelings for you." Their words resonated within her, and all she could manage was to return his kiss with every ounce of passion she possessed. As they finally separated, Brian leaned his forehead gently against hers. His eyes fluttered shut, as though relishing the experience. "This time, I won't let you slip away," he murmured. Emily beamed gently, her heart brimming with joy. "What if I express that I have no desire to attend?" Brian opened his eyes and gazed at her, a fresh and powerful light flickering within them. "Nothing in this world can stand in my way when it comes to claiming you as my own." The subsequent months were the most joyful of Emily's existence. She and Brian ultimately embraced their feelings, and despite the ongoing challenges of collaborating, they discovered a way to find balance. On those charged meeting days, they debated contracts and deadlines fervently. On serene evenings, they savored meals, exchanged laughter, and indulged in secret kisses in the kitchen. For the very first time, Emily experienced a sense of wholeness. Her heart was devoted to him. And Brian, a man who had always been composed, logical, and wary of feelings, discovered how to love her in the most profound and genuine manner imaginable. Yet, he sensed that an essential piece remained elusive. He devised a strategy for it. That evening, Brian whisked Emily away for an extraordinary dinner experience. They had shared nearly a year together, and she felt a shift in the atmosphere, yet she remained unaware of the impending change. The restaurant featured an intimate terrace, softly illuminated by twinkling lights reminiscent of stars in the night sky. The ambience was refined and cozy, and Emily felt her heart quicken as she observed Brian appearing more anxious than he typically did. "How are you doing?" she inquired with a grin. "I've never felt more certain about anything in my life." Her eyebrow arched, curiosity piqued. Before she could utter another word, Brian rose from his chair. Emily furrowed her brow, a look of perplexity crossing her face. "Brian, who are you?" Yet her voice faltered in her throat the instant he knelt before her. Emily sensed time freeze around her. The eatery that surrounded them faded away. The cacophony, the dazzling lights, the throngs of people, all blurred into the background, leaving only Brian Fisher in sharp focus, kneeling before her, presenting an open velvet box that cradled a breathtaking ring. His eyes brimmed with feeling, yet his voice remained calm and assured as he finally expressed himself. "Emily Carter, this was never part of my intentions. It's hard to believe I find myself in this moment, down on one knee, inviting someone to embark on a lifelong journey together." Emily sensed the sting of tears welling up in her eyes. "But then you arrived," Brian continued, grinning, "and transformed my entire existence. You evoked emotions in me that I never believed possible. You awakened a desire within me that I never realized I had." She pressed her hands to her mouth, overwhelmed by her feelings. "My dearest Emily, my heart is yours, and I long to share each and every day of my life by your side. I long to share laughter with you, engage in playful arguments, explore the globe together, and return home with the comfort of knowing you'll be waiting for me." He grasped her hand with conviction, gazing deeply into her eyes. "So, would you consider becoming my partner for life?" Emily released a breathless laugh, tears cascading down her cheeks. "Absolutely. Absolutely, without a doubt, yes." The restaurant burst into cheers as Brian gently placed the ring on her finger. He rose to his feet, drawing her into a fervent kiss brimming with unspoken vows. In that instant, Emily understood. No force in existence could sever their bond. They were meant for one another. Eternally. The day unfolded beautifully. The sky stretched out in a brilliant blue, a gentle breeze danced through the air, and the sun cast its soft glow, enveloping the morning in warmth. Emily could scarcely fathom that this day had truly arrived. She donned a breathtaking white gown, adorned with intricate lace that embraced her silhouette, complemented by a flowing veil that cascaded elegantly to the ground. Her hair was arranged in a sophisticated updo, and her hands quivered gently as she clutched a bouquet of white flowers. Within the hall, the attendees assembled, eagerly awaiting the moment everyone had been looking forward to. Yet for Emily, amidst the throng, there was only one individual who held significance, and he stood there, patiently awaiting her arrival. Brian stood at the altar, clad in a perfectly tailored suit, yet it was not that which captivated her gaze. His gaze lingered on her, filled with a reverence that suggested she was the most valuable treasure in his world. Emily pressed her lips together, stifling the urge to cry, and started her journey down the aisle. With every step, her heart raced with increasing intensity. As she finally stood beside him, Brian took her hand and whispered gently, "You look beautiful." With a gentle smile, she watched as the officiant commenced the ceremony. Each word uttered resonated with a significance that eclipsed all else in existence. At last, the moment Emily had anticipated her entire life arrived as the officiant inquired, "Brian Fisher, do you take Emily Carter to be your wife, pledging to love her, honor her, and stand by her side for all the days of your life?" Brian grasped her hand more firmly. His eyes sparkled with deep emotion, and his voice remained steady yet brimming with sentiment as he replied, "With all my heart, yes." Emily experienced a tightness in her throat, and as the officiant faced her, she believed her heart might overflow with joy. "Emily Carter, do you choose Brian Fisher as your husband, vowing to love him, honor him, and remain by his side for all the days of your life?" She inhaled deeply, gazing at the man who had transformed her existence in every conceivable manner, and then she beamed with all her heart. "Absolutely, without a doubt, eternally yes." Brian chuckled softly, his gaze brimming with affection. "With the authority granted to me, I hereby declare you united as husband and wife." Before the officiant could complete the sentence, Brian drew Emily near, encircling her waist with his arms and kissing her passionately, prompting cheers and applause from the guests. She chuckled softly against his lips, experiencing a joy beyond her wildest dreams. What are your thoughts on the narrative of Brian and Emily? Share your reflections in the comments section. Please provide a rating for this story on a scale from 0 to 10. What's your rating? Be sure to subscribe and activate notifications so you won't miss any of our narratives. Be sure to explore additional heartfelt tales by clicking here on the final screen.